We are knee deep into the Habakkuk sermon series.
Yeah,
it's
good.
It is good.
Finally got here.
It's true. And Micah, you just kicked off some teaching for us this past weekend with Habakkuk 1:1. I was joking during our service prep to our whole production and worship team, just that Micah's going to go for 38 minutes on one verse, and you just had this look. It's not one, Miles. And so but either way, no, it's a fantastic start to our series. I think it's very interesting. A lot of the points that you raised and a lot of the things you brought to the table. But those of you that are kind of tuning in and aren't familiar with the voices you're hearing or the faces you're seeing, this is Micah Hasty. He is our worship pastor at the North Canton Chapel, and I'm Miles Quibido, the creative and production director. And so knowing that, also, if you are watching this and you're seeing the double denim jacket situation going on,
it's just a thing that happens.
It's a thing that happens. Micah did not call me this morning giddy to ask me if I was going to wear my jacket. We just showed up and it's happening.
Here we are. It's good.
Confidently wearing it. I thought about taking off mine, but then I thought about it and no, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful collision. That's
a David Crowder reference.
Is it?
That's a way back reference.
Maybe that's deep in my brain and it just came out. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Habakkuk 1:1.
Yeah.
The way that verse reads is very straightforward, very simple. It says this. It says, the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. That's it. Spicy.
Yeah.
So I guess all that to say is that springboarding off of that one verse, that one short sentence, what is an oracle in relation to the Bible? Let's just kind of jump right into that, because that's the one spicy word used in there beyond prophet that is worth noting.
Yeah. So, I think we did joke quite a bit about the single verse.
Sure.
But I think there's a lot of times we'll quickly read over a verse like this. And when we do, we miss the greater context of what's going on with everything that follows.
Context is key. We got to know.
Right. And so we see it as this brief introduction and then on we go. We just, dear Micah, and off we run.
Right.
But with this specifically, these words, oracle and prophet, they carry a lot of weight. And they carried a lot of weight when they were said then, and they carry a lot of weight for us now to help us better understand those things.
Right.
So an oracle throughout the Old Testament, when we see that word, it's typically aligned with either a message or a vision that is given from God to a prophet. It's almost always a message of judgment, and it's always named as to who that's going to be about.
Sure.
And so it would be, hey, this is an oracle for Miles about the coming judgment.
I'm excited. Yay. Good to know.
Right, which is terrible.
Yeah.
But it always was this precursor. When people heard the word oracle, it was a judgment is coming.
Yeah.
There's something.
Hold on to your seats.
Right.
What's about to be said is a thing.
Right. Yeah. This is different than a prophet going, hey, here's some things that God is going to do.
Right.
This is it was a very specific type of prophetic word. And within that, for this specific oracle in Habakkuk, it's different because it's not often, in fact, in none of the other 18 instances of oracle in the Old Testament does this happen. But with Habakkuk specifically, it's not a pronouncement. It's not a, hey, here's some things that God is giving Habakkuk that he wants us to all see and know as a message. But rather, God gives Habakkuk a vision and includes himself in it. So we have this dialogue that happens all throughout the book between Habakkuk and God.
Interesting.
And how the prophet deals with what the judgment is to come, how that fleshes out with him. And really, we get to see this intense glimpse into how Habakkuk processes that, what his emotions are around it, how he feels about God in response to it. And throughout the series, we're going to really dive deep into that and go, what does that mean for us? Because there's some things that Habakkuk says that quite honestly, if you or I, if we said them out loud, we might go, hey man, is everything okay?
Yeah, right.
Do you still believe in God?
Yeah, for sure.
Because he really does. He throws some hard accusations at God and goes, look, I see all this sin going on.
Right.
I see all this wrongdoing. In fact, we're going to look at it in this upcoming Sunday, whenever I'm looking at that in week 2 of this series. And he comes to him and says, this wrongdoing confronts me.
Right.
It's this very personal in his face. It is intimately acquainted with him. And he's going, I see all of this. God, where in the world are you?
Yeah.
Why don't you see it? What are you doing?
Yeah.
And so that, just that whole idea of judgment, of oracle, and how that carries through throughout the Old Testament, but specifically in Habakkuk, it's always really interesting because it is this judgment. But with Habakkuk, it's unique, again, because we get to see how a human being can hold the faith, can have this deep faith in God, but also have all of these questions and accusations and come to him in that way.
Well, it's such an interesting thing because I feel like, and this is like a small tangent that I'm even just kind of like spontaneously thinking about. I think that the interesting nature of kind of when we think of prophet or oracle for that matter, but just like in our mind, we see this very confident, this very exclaiming, this very like, I know exactly what I'm saying, how I'm going to say it, and there's no confusion on the intent. I am for it, supporting it, and get it 100%. Yeah. And what we're seeing and what you're saying is that's not always the case. Sometimes the vessel is not as confident as the word being put out, especially as it relates to some of the things we learn, later in the New Testament is like God's ways are higher than our ways. We are people. He is God. And sometimes when we're told to carry out the message of God, we don't fully know what he's doing inside of that. And so everything you're saying about Habakkuk and his intention is kind of curious, and even kind of maybe to run concurrently with that idea is like we think about Habakkuk, like you said, opening up, we're clarifying who he is, what he's about to do. And then even you mentioned briefly, those of you that are sticking with us, wait for next week because Mike is exactly right. There is a bit of a burden and a like not fully getting what God's doing. But then inversely, we look at Jonah. We look at this guy and he's just like, God's putting him on a path to go to Nineveh. And he almost in the opposite perspective is just like, I'm not doing anything. I don't want to do it. Right. He gets swallowed by a whale.
Drags his feet the whole way.
Yeah. And then even then, when the not to spoil Jonah for anybody, but the way that it all goes, he goes to Nineveh, God delivers him. And first Jonah goes to rebuke him, but ultimately God like spares Nineveh and Jonah is ticked. So again, talking about people that are the mouthpiece of God in these moments in the Old Testament, but carrying out the will of God isn't always as clear to the person as much as the faithfulness in their walk to get there.
Right. And there's a piece of that too, where both Jonah and Habakkuk, like even though Jonah drags his feet to get there, like they both have to wrestle with this faithfulness to do what God has called them to do. Even if it doesn't go the way they want it to go. Right. Because conversely with both of them, like with Habakkuk, like he has to present this judgment. He doesn't like what's going to happen because he knows he's a recipient of it.
For sure.
And then with Jonah, he's going, man, I want the judgment. Like, confront, do it. Get like wipe him off the map. And then God shows this incredible mercy and grace.
It's amazing.
And they don't know what to do with
it.
Yeah.
And so there's always like, to your point in the way that it is, there's just like, you can't always assume that the person carrying out the message is always in complete knowledge of it. And I think it promotes this idea of humanity to the people that are faithful to what God tells them to do.
Yeah. Well, and it also presents this thought that we can come to the table like full of faith and having doubt. Like we can hold these things together, like faith and doubt. Like just doubt does not mean that it's the opposite of faith. Like these things work hand in hand, and we see that often in the minor prophets, specifically in the Old Testament, and truthfully in our own lives.
Yeah, for sure.
But we've believed a lie, I think, many of us, that if we have doubt, that it means, well, then I don't have enough faith.
Yeah.
And what it could really mean is, no, I do have faith. I just don't understand how it all works.
That's true.
And I've got I'm trying to figure this thing out. And so we come to God with faith and doubt, and then he meets us with grace and truth.
Oh,
and just walks us through like, hey, I'm good. I'm God, no matter what, let's go. Like, let's do this thing together.
Absolutely. So kind of like tracking through all of that to kind of like root us back to this idea of oracle, Habakkuk, what we're about to kind of dive into. You had another passage that you made a pass at.
Yeah. So in Psalm 13, so the thing that we will see over and over again in Habakkuk, and it's actually something that for a while, there were some theologians that would kind of look at Habakkuk and go, we don't even know if this is all written by the same guy because of how disjointed it felt, especially when you get into like chapter 3 and you start looking at that.
Shifts,
there's a massive tone shift. And so they're going, what is this? But really what Habakkuk does is, and we see it very early on at the beginning of the oracle, he starts quoting scripture. And the thing that I think is so beautiful about that is that we see Habakkuk in a spot where he does bring faith and doubt hand in hand to God. He doesn't like the way that this is all going to shape out. He has to wrestle with what do we do next? How does he hold the judgment of God while also trusting the sovereignty of God and the goodness of God in that? What does he do? And what he does is he goes back to the scripture that he knows and he begins to quote the scriptures that he has grown up with, the things that have anchored him in his faith as he has followed God. And so at the beginning of, let me start in Habakkuk. So it's chapter 1. And then verses 2, I'll just read verse 2. It says, "How long, Lord, must I cry for help, but you do not listen? I call out to you violence, but you do not deliver." And then we go to Psalm 13, verse 1, where it says, "How long, Lord, will you continue to ignore me? How long will you pay no attention to me? How long must I worry and suffer in broad daylight? How long will my enemy gloat over me? Look at me, answer me, O Lord my God, revive me or else I will die." Right? Like there's so much of this that even in his suffering and even in his frustration, he brings passages to mind that he knows are parts of scripture.
Sure.
And they run so closely, so hand in hand. And so we see that psalm written by King David, that's this king that is named a man after God's own heart.
Yeah.
And the way that he speaks to God, even in these moments, is, "God, where are you? How long? How long am I going to have to endure this?" And what we see over and over again is God going, "I am at work.
Yeah.
I am working. I am moving. You may not see it, or it may not be happening in the way you would prefer it to happen.
Yeah.
But I'm here. I am working. Trust me."
Yeah, for sure. And so, I mean, that's an interesting kind of like way of putting it still. And again, it roots back to some of those pieces we were saying about before. Faith and doubt are not mutually exclusive. Like there are things about the ideas of those two that do meet hand in hand, especially when we're dealing with people, like human beings, and meeting an all-knowing, omnipotent, fully controlling God. Like he knows what's up.
Yeah.
And so I think Habakkuk is going to be one of those books that we're going to see this humanity of a prophet fleshed out in full, especially as it relates to the people he's speaking to. And
Well, he does this beautiful thing. So not just in his suffering, but again, I won't spoil it because I know that we're going to talk in future touch points about chapter 3 and those kind of things. But he really does go to this spot where he just starts encouraging his own soul with the truth of scripture.
Yeah. You got to do that.
Right. And I think for us, and we talked briefly about it on Sunday, even with the prophet and the word prophet, and how do we know these things are good? Like even in the New Testament, what does that mean? And how do we navigate that? I know we don't have all the time to get into all that here.
We could sit here for a while.
We'd be here for a while. But there's a piece of it in when Paul is walking through, how do we evaluate this thing?
Yeah.
How do we evaluate prophecy? And he says, hold everything against what is good. Like test it, examine it. And so what does Habakkuk do whenever he has to figure out, what do I do with these things that God is doing? The things that I don't understand. He essentially is testing it.
Yeah.
He's going back to scripture. He's evaluating his circumstances against the grain of scripture and going, what do I know about this God that I worship?
Right.
What do I know that is true about him? Okay, let me anchor myself back to those things and then go into life as it comes.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's, and I know that in a way you're kind of like pushing into this too. It's just like, that is a solid bet for anybody, anytime, for any situation.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be this like grandiose thing of like, I'm delivering retribution to an entire nation. It is like, oh my gosh, as I'm walking through my day, I wake up as an individual, a single mom, or just anybody who's trying to take on life. And there's this position of, God, where are you with what's going on? And I mean, you pulling out Psalms, you're making all sense of how the most revered persons, David, a man after God's own heart, is a guy that at some point in his life, multiple points we've seen, has put his fist to the sky and said, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And I think, again, that just promotes this idea of humanity for the people that are in scripture. I think so often we set this expectation on ourselves and for others at times where it's just as we're walking through our faith and we're seeing these moments of, faith and doubt hand in hand.
Yeah.
We try to almost like before we give God a chance to condemn us, we condemn ourselves.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because even the most like elevated authority, you would say oracle or prophet, king, all these different people, even in their positions of life, were willing to have written down the level of doubt that they have so we can see it now. And so I think that, like I said, there are a lot of interesting kind of like psychoanalyzations of the people and persons in scripture that are important for us to know. Is it the most like prescriptive thing. Do you need, I can this way, be this person, do this thing. It's not always, but descriptively, we can see that there's an interesting way that Habakkuk, King David, all these people approach life and approach faith.
Sure.
It's quite exciting to see.
And if we believe that scripture is God-breathed, that is profitable for instruction, for reproof, like we walk through these things. If we believe that to be true about scripture, and we believe that what is in our Bible, like the canon of scripture, is the things that we need and the things that God knew we would need to understand him rightly, to understand how to relate to him, then this tiny little 3-chapter book in the back of the Old Testament, like this little prophet that is so easy to just like glaze over and not even think about, like we need it. Like we need to see what this interaction is, how it fleshes out, because it helps us to understand God better and to respond to him better. That's true.
There's a reason why it's there. And there's a reason why as a church we're going through it. And I'm excited to keep doing it. So, I mean, Micah, like I said, solid start to the series, and it's going to be awesome to continue on and see how this whole thing lands. And if this is your first time tuning into Touchpoint, first time checking out a series, whether online or in person, keep with us, keep sticking with us. And Micah, thank you so much for hanging out with us, bro.
I love it.
See you.